Welcome to the wild world of the diagnostic laboratory industry, where we focus on science, compliance, sales marketing, and self-mastery. Welcome to Lab Results with Blake. I'm your host, Blake Bork. All right, welcome to Lab Results with Blake. This is Blake Bork, and I am with a good friend, Mr. William Baus. Today, William and I are going to talk about pharmacogenomic testing and some of the billing aspects of it that a lot of laboratory owners have. Sometimes these questions go unanswered for a very long time, and it ends up causing complications for the laboratory, problems inside of audits and medical necessity. Depending on where you are in the country concerning MolDX, you have bigger problems when it comes to molecular testing. And so we'll touch a little bit on the sales aspect of it and the clinical utility of it, as well as the medical necessity of it and the DX codes of it. And then I'm happy to have a co-pilot in William Baus to be able to help me explain all that. William, how are you doing today?
Fantastic. Glad to be here with you.
Awesome. So you're sharing your screen right now, so it's going to basically dominate the visual conversation. Those of you guys who are listening while you're driving, please keep your eyes on the road. But yeah, man, excited to talk with William about this. William, give me just a little bit of a refresher on your background and your expertise and why you're the guy who we should be listening to when it comes to PGX testing and billing for it.
Well, absolutely. Been in explicitly laboratory billing. Prior to that, it was out-of-network chiropractic, which interestingly, there's a lot of similarities with how payers think about chiropractors, as well as out-of-network labs. So that prepared me very well. But once I ran into laboratory, I never stopped. I never looked back again. So for the past 14 years. So I started out when Tox was the du jour of the day and watched that go through its rise and decline, and several other rises and declines, and PGX has had its rise, decline, and now it's comeback in the form of Medicare, recognizing that it has a lot of clinical utility for their patients, and consequently should be well accepted by all commercial payers. If we have time, we will get into discussing what that is, but it's predominantly a Medicare play right now. And well, United Commercial will do it, but remember, you're going to need a Z code to bill them as of April 1st, which has already occurred. So you're already there. You got a Z code for PGX, then you're good to go with billing to United under very specific conditions. And when it's time to talk about that, we will. Right. Normally what I would do is I would go and say, hey, well, what is PGX? It's pharmacogenomic testing. It is testing how your particular personal genetic makeup is going to handle the metabolization of drugs. So what's really important to understand here is it isn't every gene. And some of the genes that we used to get paid for in the past are no longer considered covered PGX genes by Medicare because they're using nationally recognized standard bodies called CPIC or the FDA.
Let me give a little bit of who this is going to be important to, right? Just real quick. So if you are a toxicology laboratory and you've been doing traditional tox, whether it's urine or oral fluid for, since 2012, 13, or if you just decided to get into it, pharmacogenomics is a good crossover if you are looking at psychiatric medications and the medication management, right? Of making sure that there's no interactions between the medications that they're taking or side effects that can be avoided. These patients are going to metabolize this medication uniquely to their own DNA. And you now can avoid, as a doctor, prescribing something that could build up to toxic levels inside of their system. It's a great test if you have tox business already. It's also a great test if you have women's health business. It's a great test if you're calling on long-term care facilities, because a lot of these are polypharmaceutical patients. They're on multiple medications, cardiac meds, as well as psych meds. I'm going to ask William about what the pain outlook is for pain genes. I know you kind of always had kind of a cloudy outlook on how pain's treated. But when you think about, I have an infectious disease laboratory and I'm doing PCR testing, okay? and I'm calling on long-term care facilities, or I'm calling on women's health facilities, or I'm calling on even urology, right? Where we have patients that are taking multiple medications at the same time. And medication mismanagement is like the number 2 or 3 killer of the Medicare population. They're polypharmaceutical. It's important that doctors have this information, and Medicare will pay for this test once in the lifetime of the patient, right? So that's who should be listening to this. And if you're a salesperson and you've got a book of business and your laboratory is not selling PGX, boy, we'd love to talk to you about how they could be selling PGX. And William's the guy who can tell you how to make sure you collect appropriately and compliantly on that PGX book of business. All right, William, that's the audience.
Great, great. And also to be clear, a PGX test isn't just a PGX test. There are multiple genes. Every gene has its own CPT code. Now we can be doing a panel. There's a new panel code for us, 81418, which by Medicare is payable at $917.08. It includes the 2 main genes you were just discussing, Blake, for psychiatric, psychotropics, SSRIs, tricyclics, this sort of thing. It's 2D6, 2C19. And in Novitas, it's a little bit more difficult. And we'll get into what I mean by that from an ordering perspective. But if you're billing out of a MolDX MAC, you have a less ordering requirement problem because of the diagnostic codes. And I'll get into all of that. But first step first is, well, not every gene is payable with every drug. But one thing that is clear, the FDA and the CPIC are listing them. Each one of your MACs, a MAC being a Medicare administrative contractor. So there's Novitas here and over here, for example, Palmetto's here, First Coast over here, Noridian's, all of this over here. These are Medicare administrative contractors. The ones that use MolDX are listed for you over here. You can find them over here. In Novitas, we don't have to worry about having a Z code and technical assessment when we're billing Medicare. We would if we were going to bill United. So you want to work with folks that have Z code. And by the time you see this, we will have one for 81418. And that'll make it very easy. If you happen to have a lab that is in Palmetto, CGS, Noridian, or WPS, now you don't have to worry about a specific diagnostic code relationship in addition to having a medication and a gene that you are testing. And so
and it's just good for sales reps to also understand, because we have a lot of sales reps that listen to the podcast, for them to understand, why can't my lab bill for this test? And it's unfortunate because there's so much misinformation, and lab owners, I don't know why they lie. I don't know why they don't just seek to understand, but sometimes they'll tell sales reps something that's not necessarily true, and there becomes this lab legend. And ultimately, the world got split about 2 years ago whenever it comes to MolDX. And so about half the country, if you look at it right there, your Novitas, your NGS, is WPS allowed or not, William?
WPS is MolDX.
Is MolDX. Okay, so you look at the country, all of Palmetto, they started this, right? Palmetto's been super aggressive with making sure that they curtail molecular spending. So they created this process, and then they leased the process and the technology to WPS and to Noridian. Okay, so dirty little secret is, the guys who have Novitas, boy, they do not like the people at Palmetto. They compete, right? And the people who have Novitas also manage Blue Cross Blue Shield of Florida, and First Coast is kind of in that Florida. So those two groups are not following Palmetto's lead. They'll do their own thing, but they're not going to follow Palmetto's lead. Is that kind of your understanding too, William?
Yeah. I mean, MolDX has been around since 2011. Palmetto, who is owned by North Carolina Blue Cross Blue Shield, who owns Celeron, that owns Palmetto and CGS, by the way.
Wow.
Then Palmetto in turn owns the MolDX program. And then that MolDX program, as you mentioned, could be utilized by these other MACs like Noridian or WPS or CGS. Basically, it's an admission of those MACs. Hey, I don't know how to handle this the molecular testing stuff. So I want you to do it for me. And they're doing a pretty good job of figuring out how to make it so that things are just not covered and not paid for. That's the infectious disease arena for UTI, nail, and wound. You're really not going to have a good chance to get a Z code, but that's a topic for another day, and we can get down into that for a couple of hours.
But if you're in Novitas and you're in First Coast,
yep,
you're in NGS, and so that NGS region, all of the basically New England states, in the middle, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and then Novitas, huge patient populations in Novitas and Florida. You can bill without a Z code, and you can bill PGX, you can bill infectious disease. It's pretty much business as usual. They've tightened down with the LCDs, of course. But if you're not, that's why your laboratory all of a sudden stops selling it.
Right. Yeah. And I'll make a distinction about why there's only one test that I think is actually better, easier to have the ordering requirements met for the test that you would want to be in a MolDX MAC. You actually have an advantage doing that PGX there. So there's good news for you. If you're in MolDX, there's no reason why you shouldn't be doing PGX. You just need a Z code and technical assessment, and it's not the same problem as it is with, say, nail wound UTI, right? So there are 4 factors that come together to create medical necessity for a PGX test. First of all, it's got to be genes that have a gene-drug relationship, and those two things always go together. They don't order genes. They're ordering a med that they're either prescribing or considering for prescription for a patient that they want to know selection of that med, avoidance of that med, or dosage of that med. That is why you are ordering a test. The why is the clinical utility. The why is the medical necessity. The why is what makes it okay for you to get paid for a test that gets ordered that you run. If you don't have clinical utility, you don't have medical necessity, then it's not something they're going to pay for. And so the FDA and the CPIC have said these genes in combination with these drugs have actionability. To make the next step of connection, the doctor has to say, I want a test on this med for this patient because I'm looking at avoiding this med, or I'm looking at possibly selecting this med, or I'm already prescribing the med and I want to look at my dosage because I've had something going on where the patient isn't reacting to the medication the way that I expect them to. Now, the nice thing about Medicare is you can be considering a med and say that you're evaluating it for selection or dosage, for example. Now, with United, they also pay for PGX. They also pay for PGX under basically these same conditions. But they want to hear about that you've already prescribed it and had an adverse reaction. Like, hey, the med was being taken by the patient, but they've discontinued, taking the med as prescribed because maybe they're gaining weight and they don't like that, right? And so I'm looking for another med that might help them out, right? Now, there's provider qualifications you can see here. So you want to make sure that who's ordering the test is the doctor that is prescribing the medication to the patient. This goes back to clinical utility and medical necessity. If the doctor that is ordering a test isn't the one that is prescribing and managing the medication for the patient, well, then they're not the right person to be ordering the test. So you're not going to have a psych doctor managing the cardio meds for the patient. So you don't need a cardio panel if you're selling to psychiatric, right? Now, if you're selling into a nursing home, well, now you've got a medical director that's overseeing all the pantheon of meds that person is taking. So now you're okay, right? But you wouldn't expect to see a cardiologist ordering psych meds or a psychiatrist ordering cardio meds. Now, you could see maybe a general practitioner managing, polypharmacy for a patient, and that might make sense as well. So there is a lot of general applicability of this test to different types of providers, but you want to make sure you're paying attention and you know what you're doing with that, right? Now, you also need diagnostic codes. Now, the variation on this is depending on what MAC you're in, and there's only 2 kinds of MACs. There are either Moldex Max or there are non-Moldex Max. There are three nons. There's Novitas, First Coast, and NGS. Now, NGS itself doesn't really have the PGX policy in place. They are an anomaly. So if you're in those areas, we're going to have to talk very specifically about what's going on there. They actually don't have the PGX LCD and billing and coding article. You have to deal with a bunch of separate biomarkers. They're 10 years in the past, just like the commercial payers for the most part are kind of stuck about what was going on 10 years ago. They want to pay for about 3 or 4 things, and it's not related to the same criteria that CPIC and the FDA say are there. There's roughly 170 gene drug billable combinations, right? This drug, I'm prescribing it, and if you're running that gene on your panel, which we probably are running most of them, now you have a billable event so long as the doctor records prescribing or currently prescribed, or I am currently prescribing or thinking about prescribing this med, and I want to evaluate this med for selection, avoidance, or dosage. What you don't want is, hey, here's a med list, throw it at you at the lab, and then lab, you figure out if I need a PGX test or not. Doc has to say, this med, I want to evaluate it for a PGX test for selection, avoidance, or dosage, and here's a diagnostic code. Now, if you are in a Moldex Mac, you're done. If you are in Novitas or First Coast, you have another hurdle to jump over. It can't just be any diagnostic code. Every single gene has a relationship to a group of required diagnostic codes. And if you don't have one of those required diagnostic codes, they're going to deny the test. So the doctors have to be aware, and they need to understand what they're doing. If you look at some of, say, the psychiatric diagnostic codes, for example, there might be issues of bipolarism or being bipolar. Let's say, I don't know if bipolarism is even a word, but there's different versions of that diagnostic code. It could be episodic, it could be reoccurring, it could be in remission or something like that, right? And so maybe what they picked when they first diagnosed the patient is a diagnostic code that is talking about being bipolar, which is the reason they prescribe the antipsychotics that they're wanting to evaluate. But that diagnostic code that they originally had isn't one of the ones in the list. It needs to be updated, and it might not even be a current diagnostic code. So one way or another, the doctors need to be aware that their diagnostic codes need to be up to date. And
how do you get them that information without it being considered steering?
It is publicly available information. It is the sole responsibility of the ordering clinician to diagnose and treat their patient. But there is nothing that says I can't say, oh, here, doc, go to
this government website.
Yeah, I mean, and this is what it looks like right here. Let's see, this is Novitas. So they'll tell you in every billing and coding article, they'll tell you what gene goes with what drug and what are the affected subgroups. So that's under the FDA table. But once you get there, then you say, okay, 81225 is CYP219. That's group 2. So then if I go to group 2, I've got a list of 100 diagnostic codes. So if they're going to order any medications that go with CYP2, was this C9? I think it was, then they need to have one of these diagnostic codes. So, you know, the doctor having access to this, right? See how you got like major depressive disorder, single episode, then they've got reoccurrent moderate. Maybe they have reoccurrent, you know, low, and it was low before, but that's actually one of the reasons why they're looking at this drug to begin with. Just make sure that their thing is up to date. And certainly it is not okay to say, hey, doc, you have to have one of these for us to get paid. And so make sure it's one of those. You can't say that, but you can say, hey, man, make sure your stuff is up to date. Right. And by the way, these are the diagnostic codes. And, you know, if we're going to have sign an ABN, and if, you know, you're ordering a test that doesn't have medical necessity and we don't get paid, well, we're going to have to bill the patient for that. Right. So make sure you pay attention to what you're doing. Right.
So what's great about this is, and what's awesome about having somebody like you who has the answers and knows where to find the answers, is for a lot of time, my experience in the lab industry, it's been like, if somebody would just tell me what to do and how to do it, I would do it. Where are the answers at? And so you just did something that's extremely valuable and important. You said, go to the government's website. They have a board there that literally says, if
Yeah.
this, then that. So now there's no reason why you as a laboratory executive or you as a laboratory CEO or you as a laboratory billing expert can't go there and figure it out. So that way you can reteach it to your salespeople.
Yep.
Answers
And
to that.
so, the requisition will already have on it the list of all the meds that are what we would need to record this medical necessity for. So there'll be the list of the meds. You don't even need to know the gene as a doctor. The gene is irrelevant. You're not asking for a test on the gene. You are asking for a test on the medication that you are prescribing to your patient that you want to evaluate for selection, avoidance, or dosage. So your rec is a list of meds. And then the doctor says, yep, I am currently or considering prescribing it. Boop, 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 boop. And then they put down for selection, avoidance, or dosage, SAD or AD or SD or DA, whatever, right? And then they write down their diagnostic code. Now, if you're in Moldex, the way to tell them how to put down the diagnostic code is, hey, doc, you are prescribing that med or you are thinking about it. You have a reason for doing that, right? Yes, you do. Okay. That's the right diagnostic code, right? They don't have that same table of, oh, that gene better have this diagnostic code, because I think it's actually kind of stupid that they even have that. It's not about diagnostic codes. It's about this med, and you want a selection, avoidance, or dosage update as the thing. It should have nothing to do with the diagnostic code, but that's the way Novitas has decided to do it. And as you can see, Moldex decided not to do it that way. But Moldex has that other requirement of, need a Z code and technical assessment. Mm-hmm. That should not be at all your problem if you're working with us, because by the time you see this, we will have one, and you would use our Z code. Since we ran the test, you don't need to get your own Z code. You use our Z code. Even if you're in Noridian, for example, and we run it in Palmetto, well, you could build it out over there. Now, we should also talk real briefly here about what I just said there. What is referencing, right? Now, this can get confusing. Medicare is okay with you as a lab billing for something you didn't run. Most commercial payers are not okay with that at all. Now, what we're talking about is transversing jurisdictions, right? You're in Novitas, well, you don't need a Z code if you want to bill it, right? But the rules I'm about to talk to work as long as you're not the lab running it, you need to understand how reference lab billing works, right? Just like you need to put down on your result when you deliver it to the doctor that ordered the test, you put down, hey, I didn't run this test. Here's the CLIA number of the lab that actually did run the test. Well, in the same thing, I got to do that in billing. I got to put down a special modifier. And then I also have to put down their CLIA as well as my CLIA for the lab that's billing it, right? To let Medicare know, hey, Medicare, just letting you know, I'm billing this as this lab that's in Texas, but it was actually run by this other lab in New York, and here's their CLIA number. And so they ran it, not me, but I'm billing for it, and we tell them that. And that's okay to do.
And that also is you saying that you purchased the test, right? So as you're doing that, you purchased the test. Otherwise, if you don't pay for the test and you say that you're billing for the test, would that be considered fraud?
Well, nobody's ever really asked me that question because nobody's going to run the test for you for free. So,
but one of the problems with reference laboratories, and this is kind of why I'm digging it out, is that they tend to be late or slow or not pay their reference bills.
Oh, well, yeah, but I mean, that has nothing to do with Medicare. They don't care about that. I mean, whether you got paid for running a test or somebody billed for a test that you never got paid for, that's not a Medicare problem. That's a you problem to figure out with what you need to get paid for performing your services, right? I would, take them to jail over that, right? Well, not jail, but I would sue them over my money, right? Yeah. Now, but there are some things that get kind of complicated about that. Like, for example, a physician-owned laboratory can't do this, right? This is independent labs can reference between each other. Physician-owned labs cannot do that, right? They have a safe harbor under anti-kickback and Stark and all that kind of stuff because they only run samples in-house and they only run them on their patients that are in-house. So they can't reference something out to test for their own patients that they're doing, and they cannot they can also not ever pay someone else to run their test. Now, they could pay someone else to run their test, but then they have to put down exactly what they paid for the test on the requisition, and then they would have to charge exactly the same amount. And so by the time you get done doing all that, then there's no financial reason for wanting to have done that, which is exactly why Medicare and almost every state has some concept of anti-markup or pass-through billing. This is also why you can't do this with commercial payers. They will see that and not pay. If you're in network, it's written into your contract. You want to get paid under your contract with me, and I'm Blue Cross and you're a lab, then you better be running that test yourself. You let someone else run that test, well, then why the hell did I contract with you? I should have contracted with them, right? So if you're running your own test, you're going to get your in-network contract rate. You put the modifier down that says, hey, I didn't run the test, then they're mostly not going to pay you, right? They're going to think that's pass-through billing. Now, why doesn't Medicare think it's pass-through billing when it's a lab-to-lab? Well, that's predominantly because it wasn't designed to do this that we're talking about. It was designed that, hey, sometimes you're going to have tests that you can't run for whatever reason. Your lab goes down, the reagents go out, your lab director goes on hiatus, and your stuff isn't working right, so you need someone else to run your samples for a while. That's why there's the 30/70 rule, where you could reference out up to 30% of your Medicare claim volume to another lab. And they're okay with it because it was designed for, hey, that's not your primary business. Definitely don't want to be a closet lab, all that kind of stuff. But I'm getting too far off topic. I just did want to point out, common ownership doesn't mean that you can pick whatever lab you own and whatever MAC to bill it for. To do it appropriately, once you read through the Medicare Claims Processing Manual in Chapter 16, Section 40 talks about how it is okay to reference. I've had actually conversations with lawyers who were like completely unaware. The 30/70 rule wouldn't exist if it wasn't okay for you to do it under certain conditions, right? And the only thing that common ownership does in relationship to what we're talking about is it eliminates the 30/70 rule requirement. If you own two labs, one lab owns both labs, one lab owns the other lab, or both labs have the same common ownership, then when you reference samples back and forth to each other, you don't need to worry about this 30/70 stuff, right? But that does not mean, oh, I have a lab in Palmetto, I have a lab in Novitas, I can run it anywhere and bill it out of anywhere. That absolutely has nothing to do with that. That we have to go to Section 50 called Jurisdiction of Laboratory Claims. What does jurisdiction mean? Well, these are Medicare administrative contractor jurisdictions. They are private companies, by the way. This is not the government. These are private companies that make billions of dollars processing your claims. And they're under a mandate to have a certain budget, right? But anyways, the reason why you can process a claim in one place versus another, even though you didn't run it, there's only one avenue to do that. And that is here under Section 50.5.1. And before I get there, let me just say again, the jurisdiction of payment requests for laboratory services furnished by an independent laboratory, except where indicated in what I'm about to show you, is with the MAC serving the area in which the laboratory test is performed. That means when you run the test in your laboratory, you bill it to the MAC where your laboratory is located, regardless of where the sample came from. And that is a unique element to Medicare, okay? Now, what makes it okay for your lab to run the sample or have the sample run in another location, but you bill it out in the location that it came to you, right? Well, that means the referring physician needs to order it on your rec if you're in Novitas and you want to bill it in Novitas, but you didn't run it in Novitas, you ran it in Meridian or Palmetto or somewhere else. The only reason you have a right to bill it in Novitas is because the sample was ordered from you and the sample went to you and then you sent it to the other lab to run it, then you retain the right for billing. Now you'll notice I have this big blue circle in the background talking about common ownership. The only thing that does for you is do the 30/70 rule. It doesn't mean because you have common ownership that you can have it sent directly from the referring physician to the Noridian lab to run it and then bill it out of Novitas when you never even touched the sample, you never had a hold of it. And I say this because if you read, there's only one example that gives you the right to do it. And in this instance, there's a Delaware Wilmington laboratory, and it says draws a blood specimen. Now, I inserted the words or receives a specimen because obviously not every specimen is a blood specimen, and they weren't being specific about blood specimens. And so that's what I'm kind of saying. But you have to receive it. You have to have it controlled. It needs to be on your rec. If an auditor asks you any questions about this, you better be able to show they ordered it from me, it came to me, and then I sent it somewhere else. Whether it's a common ownership lab or an external lab is irrelevant that this is okay. The only thing that makes the difference is if it happens to be a lab you also own, then you don't have to worry about the 30/70 rule. So if you're referencing to us, you need to pay attention to your 30/70. Okay. So this time, the Wilmington, Delaware laboratory draws the specimen from a patient who's ordered a blood culture. The Wilmington laboratory then sends the specimen to the Boston laboratory, which in this instance, they're related to each other, but it doesn't have to be, right? And the Boston laboratory actually performs the test. Well, what makes that okay? Is what I just got done telling you is because I can bill it out as Boston because they ran it. That's always okay. If you run a sample, you can always bill for it, okay? But also, the Wilmington laboratory may retain the billing right because they're the ones who received the sample. The order was with them. They received the sample and then they sent it out. That is the only reason and only okayness to make this okay. If you're sending samples from here, you're sending them to Noridian, they didn't go here, and this guy in Novitas has no right to bill it. And you can swap them around if you're trying to think about how to do it from Noridian to Novitas, right? It's just you swap those two words around and then you're there. Okay, so enough about all of that, I'm sure. So, in a nutshell, I need the doctor to select the medication that they are already prescribing to a patient or considering prescribing. Then I need them to say why they're doing it. It's for selection, avoidance, or dosage, or whatever else, but they all kind of break down into those three things. And then I need a diagnostic code, and that diagnostic code becomes very, 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 very important if you are in a non-MolDX MAC. And yes, you're going to have to make sure that everybody understands that their diagnostic codes need to be up to date. And of course, the provider ordering it has to have the qualifications for doing it. Let me just see if there's anything I didn't think of. NGS, yeah, they don't have any specific PGX. So NGS is here. So if you're up here in New York and North, or you're over here, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, that's a whole other topic and not so good for you.
Mm-hmm. So if you happen to be a doctor who is, and you said, it has the specialty or the qualifications to do it. So we're talking about nurse practitioners, physician assistants, typical MD doctors. That's
a 2-hour topic in and of itself. There's state regulated rules on that. They have to be billing incident 2. They have to be under the supervision of a medical doctor. And they can't be doing it on new patients. They would have to be existing patients, and treatment protocols would have to be set up by the MD. That is a topic that needs to be dealt with on an individual basis, and lawyers and other people should be involved, right? And It's very state specific. Yep.
Okay.
I'm just saying NGS does not have a favorable PGX policy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. When you said NGS, I was thinking next gen sequencing too. I kind of went.
No, these guys are national government services. I usually do preface that when I use that acronym because of the exactly what
it'll slip. Yeah, you slip back into which is the definition for this NGS.
Yeah.
All right. So from a standpoint of, you really did break down PGX billing pretty simple and succinctly. What are some of the pitfalls, even of the guys that are own billing companies and they've been billing lab for a long time?
Okay, pitfalls are going to be very the pitfalls are going to be really specific These are averages are off now. Some of that's a change. The pitfalls are going to be mostly
Go to another slide.
well, I'll just leave this one up there. The pitfalls are going to mostly be related to not getting good information. So you need the generic name of the drug, not the brand name of the drug. And and a lot of people make the mistake of this is too hard. I don't want to go out and talk to my doctors and figure out that I have a requisition form that does what I said. It needs to have the meds that you're going to result on. It needs to say selection, avoidance, and doses. Give me a diet. And then what happens is they're like, oh, here's a med list. And then they throw it at their billing and they're putting stuff in like vitamin B12. Well, I'm here to tell you that ain't a drug, number one. Number two, it's not a PGX thing at all. It's not covered. So then you got your billing company putting in crap that has no relationship to what are covered and not covered indications. And then, you don't make money because you don't have medical necessity. You don't have the right diagnostic code. You don't put a med that even matters. You don't use the generic name of the med. And all of that's taken care of by properly formatting your requisition and properly communicating to your providers that, yeah, man, I need this. Don't just give me a med list. Because there's zero clinical utility to tell me, here's the med list, do me a PGX test. You got to say, I'm prescribing or thinking about it, and here's why and what I'm going to do with the information. And this is key, not only on PGX, it's for any test. Every time we're going to talk about a test, I'm going to have to talk about this. And this has got to be understood by everybody. You wouldn't pay for a test if it wasn't going to be used in your treatment. The doctor needs to tell the payer what they're going to do with this information. I'm going to use it to select, avoid, or change my dosage. If you don't have that and it's not in their medical records, and you being the lab and you bill this, they're going to come and ask you for documentation and you don't have it. And then they're going to say, guess what? It ain't documented. It didn't happen. Give me the money back. At your own peril, you will do something different.
And then what ends up happening is the laboratory ends up taking the brunt of that. We don't prescribe the medication. We don't see the patient. We're not in control of the order. We get a requisition form, and we got our fingers crossed that they got great medical notes and that they're getting us what they need. That's why it's so important that sales reps understand this process too, that they get where they play a role in this, and that laboratories are in real time discussing these problems with requisition forms and medical documentation. And when a new account is started, that you are auditing that account at 100%. That every single sample that comes in the laboratory, don't wait until the Medicare comes in and audits you and start scrambling to find answers. Do it on the front end. Think in your mind. It's not a question of if, it's when your documentation is going to get audited by one of the payers. So if you've been through that before, it's not a fun. It's not for good times. Do the audit yourself on the front end. Make that a part of your process. That way, all the questions get answered. There's no garbage in, garbage out. You're not sitting on $2.5 million of claims where now your integrity gets called on the line of what you're going to do to protect your investment and your employees and all the stories that come up, right? Don't put yourself in that situation. Do it right the first time. There's really two. You said there's non-Moldex and Moldex mats. You either do it right or you do it again.
Yeah.
That's billing. You do it right or you do it again.
Yeah.
And the way you do these small things is the way you're going to do all things. And
that's the thing too. I've noticed that kind of stuff creeps in on people, and it's like, well, do I really need to do it? Maybe I'll just get it when I need it. And then you make those you just kind of keep eventually those bad decisions catch up to you. And you get enough of them, something will happen, right? But yeah. So the only other thing I would say is this is really predominantly a Medicare play. United would be okay as well, but you would need a Z code. Your Medicare Advantage plans are going to be requiring a Z code. So again, good reason to work with us. A lot of people might even be in Novitas, do their own thing. Well, they don't even know how to get a Z code, right? You can get one. right? You'd have to work at it, but you know, you're probably not familiar with the process and all that, right? So we have one, we're going to have one soon, right? So, and it's not the same problem. Like I think some people might be, you know, what is it called? Shell shocked, gun shy, twice bitten, once shy, that kind of thing. Oh, I tried to get a C code for, you know, RPP or UTI. Well, that's very different, right?
Right.
It's very different because they don't want to pay for it. They do want, they're screaming at the top of their lungs, we want to pay for PGX so long as you meet the criteria. And another nice thing about Moldex is you can build the panel code so long as you have 2 qualifying genes, which is important, right? When you're in Novitas, everything's kind of built out individually. They do understand the 81418, but there are some limitations on that. And so you can engage my services to help you understand that kind of those little details that make a big difference in your reimbursement. But I think you've got enough information to understand the play.
Beautiful. Give me your contact information. If somebody wants to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
William at labrevenuenavigator.com.
Beautiful. So they email you, and then your beautiful assistant gets with them and schedules a call, and you have an onboarding call. Anything they need to do to come prepared for that call? Send you any info, questions, or they just show up with a bright attitude?
Yeah, show up with the right attitude, but you know, if you gave me a heads up, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you tell me a week before or the day I get there. I'm going to need to know where your lab's located to know whether I'm talking about Moldex or not. And if you're in NGS, National Government Services, which again are New York and all these states over here, or Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois over here, probably not the best play for you, but we could try to look at it. Yeah.
Is that all molecular or just PGX?
Just for PGX, they just, for whatever reason, normally they will have a policy very similar to Novitas. But in general, I think of National Government Services as being more restrictive and a little slower to move towards something that will increase their outpouring of payment. And so, like, just to give you an example, the gastro panels, right? Well, Novitas will pay for up to the second tier, 6 to 11 gastro targets with R19.7 acute diarrhea, right? Well, NGS is only going to pay up to the first tier, the 3 to 5 target. So, and you'll see things like that in general. If they have a similar policy, NGS will be slightly more restrictive. In this particular context, in PGX context, they literally just do not have a PGX policy at all. They have a biomarker policy, which does reference some of the genes, but it's not referencing CPIC. It's not referencing anything else, you know, like the FDA. Very, very different way of thinking about it over there. It should be changing. You know, honestly, especially with the advent of the biomarker laws, which are very favorable towards PGX. Basically, anything's a biomarker. In this context, PGX testing is clearly a biomarker. In fact, it's even mentioned in some of the biomarker laws explicitly. Pharmacogenomic testing is listed. And then they say, look, if there's an NCD or an LCD, and yes, we have LCDs. That's what we've just been talking about all day, right? If there is an LCD, then the payers in those states that are governed by those insurance companies have to pay. Now, the problem is it works at the state level, not the federal level. But what I mean by that, though, is wherein we have them in Texas. We got them in Florida. Florida's going to be in 2025. We're coming out guns blazing. 28 states already have them either proposed or on the books. The rest of the country is going to follow suit. It's a non-bipartisan thing. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you want to go to the House and say, I brought testing to my state, right? Because this is opening the floodgates for all the BS about, ooh, it's experimental investigational. And in this context, PGX is a prime candidate for this because it's not experimental investigational. We have LCDs. We also have nationally recognized standard bodies saying under what conditions it is clinically actionable. That is CPIC and the damn FDA itself, right? So I'm looking forward to utilizing those for billing purposes. So you're probably going to need help doing that. Not many people know about this, right?
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Great, man.
Awesome.
Always a pleasure chatting with you about billing and lab and life in general. You're going to be at the Executive War College?
Yes, sir. Looking forward to it. Looking forward to seeing you there, man.
All right. Yeah, I'm gonna go show my face a little bit. It's a busy month, man, but we're gonna try to get over there and I don't drink anymore, but I'll buy you a Diet Coke.
All right, but I'll have a beer. You have the Coke.
All right, sir. Well, look, thank you so much, guys. Hope you enjoy listening to this podcast. Like it, share it, subscribe to it. More importantly, if you've got a billing question, reach out to William Baus. If you're watching this and you're a laboratory owner and you have questions about where to send your PGX samples to, whether that's a reference laboratory opportunity where you're like, hey, I don't want to invest in the technology or the platform, but I want to send it, reach out to us as well. We've got partner laboratories, regardless if it's toxicology, if it's infectious disease testing, if it's pharmacogenomics. There are laboratories in our network that we can get you paired up with, so that way you can go out and sell it. And we also have advice on how to position it, how to sell it, how to cross-sell it, and how to do it compliantly. So it's an end-to-end solution here. When you pair me up with a guy like William, we can go literally from the sample coming into the laboratory from the cell all the way to the collection. So literally from collection of the sample to collection of the cache. Thank you, William. Have a great weekend, brother.
Live long and prosper.
All right. You've been listening to Lab Results with Blake, with your host, Blake Bork. Please like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Remember, greatness is contagious.